A day as a bookbinder in 18th century Vienna. The first breath of dawn had not yet reached Vienna when the bookbinder opened his eyes. The city still slept beneath its mantle of frost, chimneys silent, horses still tethered in their stables, carriages unmoved. The air inside his small stone-walled home was cold enough that he could see his breath cloud slightly as he exhaled, but he did not shiver. This moment, before the world began its daily march, belonged to him alone. He sat up slowly, joints creaking like old floorboards. There was no urgency, no alarm bell to jolt him from sleep. Only habit, ritual, and the love of a craft older than himself. He reached for the woolen shawl folded at the foot of his bed and draped it across his shoulders, pausing for a moment to enjoy the warmth it trapped against his chest. The wooden floors, polished smooth by years of barefoot pacing, were cool beneath his feet. He lit the stub of a candle resting in a shallow dish beside his bed. The flame sputtered, caught, and cast a flickering halo onto the low-beamed ceiling above. Shadows danced along the stone walls, and with them came the first whisper of purpose. He moved quietly through the small adjoining room, part kitchen, part workshop. In one corner, a fireplace slumbered in grey ash. A small iron kettle hung above it, suspended from a blackened hook. He stoked the embers with gentle care, adding 3 pieces of split alder and a knot of kindling wrapped in old cloth. Within minutes, the fire responded with a pop and glow, and he smiled softly to himself. From a cupboard tucked beneath the windowsill, he retrieved his ink-making kit, a lidded glass jar, a lump of gum arabic, soot collected from a previous fire, and a small tin scoop. Everything was laid out atop a square of oiled leather, its surface worn and stained with years of use. This was not just preparation, it was an invocation. He poured water into the kettle, letting it warm over the fire while he turned his attention to the ink. The soot, ground carefully from burnt grapevine wood, was measured with care. It bore the acrid scent of smoke and old leaves, and he smiled again as it fell in a fine black cloud into the jar. Next, the gum arabic, sticky and clear like hardened honey, was shaved with a small knife and stirred in. A few drops of heated water from the kettle completed the mix. Then came the stirring, slow and meditative, as the particles dissolved and mingled into a deep obsidian black. He dipped a thin sliver of wood into the ink and let a drop fall onto a strip of parchment. It spread slowly, evenly, without feathering. Perfect. He whispered something in German, a word of approval or perhaps a private benediction. With the ink resting, he turned to the workbench. It sat against the far wall, beneath a narrow window dusted with frost. The bench was long and low, its surface littered with the tools of his trade. A bone folder smoothed to a polish, thread spools wrapped in beeswax, a brass compass, an awl, and the ever-present stack of unbound pages. Before beginning any work, he always cleaned the space. Not for hygiene, though the dust of paper and wood could accumulate quickly, but for clarity. He wiped the bench with a square of linen, folded and refolded into neat triangles as he went. Each corner of the workspace was swept by hand, each tool returned to its proper place. The ritual was calming, like smoothing wrinkles from a well-worn sheet. He finally unwrapped today's project from its cloth covering, a stack of vellum sheets, freshly printed with the first half of a philosophical treatise by an anonymous author. The words were sharp, the ink rich and unblemished. He ran a fingertip along the margin of the top page, the slight ridge of printed letters rising like a whisper. It was said, in whispers shared between binders over shared bread or cider, that some books had spirit, that the weight of thought left an impression not just in ink, but in the page itself. This one felt heavy, contemplative. He didn't need to know the words to feel the pull of them. He dipped his quill, a goose feather trimmed and carved to a perfect taper, into the ink. The sound it made when pressed against parchment was soft, like footsteps in deep snow. He did not write original words. His job was to trace marginalia, to copy faded titles onto end papers, to draft dedication lines in beautiful looping script. But every line was drawn with care. It was not simply work, it was honor, a transmission of thought across generations. The room was quiet except for the occasional soft creak of the bench beneath him. Outside, the world was beginning to wake. A faint rattle of carriage wheels echoed far down the street. The iron bell of a cathedral struck 6 times. Morning had officially begun. And yet inside the bookbinder's home, time was not linear. It moved in spirals, through ink, through parchment, through the narrowing curve of a quill. His hands, speckled with age and stained a permanent blue-black from decades of ink, moved like a pianist's. There was no hesitation, only flow. He paused only once to light a second candle and sat back in his chair, watching how the flame reflected off the still drying ink pot. The fire in the hearth had grown stronger now, casting a faint orange warmth across the room. It lit the edges of every tool in soft gold. He closed his eyes briefly and listened. To nothing, to everything. The silence to him was sacred. In that silence, books were born. Not just printed, born. Each book that passed through his hands was more than paper and glue. It was memory made physical. He remembered once binding a volume of poetry written by a widowed woman in the mountains. She had brought the pages herself, wrapped in muslin and trembling in her grip. The poems spoke of grief, but also of springtime and honeybees. She had watched him bind them in soft blue leather, weeping quietly. The bookbinder never forgot her. He looked down at his ink-stained hands. They had never wielded a sword, never held a title, but they had held stories. And that to him was enough. The scent of fresh-cut timber greeted him like an old friend. It was still early, the sun barely cresting over the rooftops of Vienna, when he stepped into the narrow corridor behind his home that served as both a storeroom and a sanctuary. This was where he kept the raw materials of his craft, stacked boards of beech, cherry, maple, and occasionally, when a merchant shipment was kind, a single slab of walnut. Each piece had been selected by hand, aged, dried, and marked with charcoal for its destined purpose. Today's task called for beechwood, pale and reliable, with a grain that held firm against the pressure of the press without splintering. It was a humble wood, overlooked by the more ostentatious artisans of Vienna who preferred exotic imports. But the bookbinder favored its honesty. He pulled a thick board from the stack and laid it gently on his work table. A line of morning light spilled through the storeroom's high window, brushing the grain with gold. He ran his fingers across the surface, tracing the faint striations like rivers on a map. Every knot, every imperfection was a fingerprint. This was not just wood. It was memory, petrified. He measured the board against a folded signature of parchment, aligning the two in a silent dialogue of proportion. Then, using a brass ruler and a piece of chalk, he marked the boundaries of the front and back covers. Notebooks of this size were often commissioned by students or theologians, bound simply but with care, meant to be carried, loved, and worn smooth at the corners. With a slow breath, he reached for his saw, not the large one he used for coarse cuts, but the fine-toothed blade kept sheathed in oilcloth. The first pass was gentle. Sawdust drifted down like snowfall, collecting on the floor and in the creases of his coat. The rhythm was steady, forward, back, forward, back. There was no need to rush. In the bookbinder's world, the moment was sovereign. Once the boards were cut, he sanded them by hand, not just to smooth, but to feel. The roughness gave way beneath the coarse grit, and soon the surface was satin soft, warm to the touch. He held it close to his face, inhaling the scent. Clean, slightly sweet, with a hint of the forest it once called home. He thought about how this tree, likely felled 2 winters ago, had grown through revolutions and marriages, had weathered snows and suns now forgotten. To bind a book in such wood was to invite the tree into a new form of life, one rooted not in soil, but in thought. Now came the engraving. Not every binder marked their work. But he, like his father before him, left a small sigil on the inside of the rear board, hidden from sight unless one knew where to look. It was a simple shape, a spiral carved with a sharp stylus. The mark had no written meaning, but it was his. It meant that these hands had shaped this form. It was his way of saying, "I was here." He warmed a small metal rod in the fire, letting the tip glow faintly red before applying it to the wood to darken the spiral slightly. A faint hiss, the scent of scorched wood. The spiral darkened just enough to be seen by moonlight. It would remain for centuries if the book was well kept. He smiled and whispered to the board, "Now you're alive again." Next came the preparation of the spine boards. These were thinner strips, flexible yet strong, to which the signatures of parchment would eventually be sewn. He sanded their edges with extra care, ensuring no snag or splinter could mar the delicate paper they would cradle. He heated his awl in the fire and began punching tiny holes at measured intervals, a task requiring absolute focus. The holes were where linen thread would pass, again and again, binding the pages to the spine, a sacred stitching. He imagined a future reader holding the book in dim light, a student perhaps, or a poet, their thumbs tracing the edge of the cover. Would they sense the care that had gone into this moment? Would they feel the warmth of the hands that shaped the wood? The thought brought him a quiet joy. The boards were now ready. He dusted them gently, then laid them in a linen cloth beside the signatures of printed parchment. The entire assembly rested like a slumbering infant, waiting for the press. As he tidied the workspace, he noticed a sliver of wood had lodged beneath his thumbnail. He removed it with a small pin, watching as a bead of blood bloomed, then faded. It was not the first time. He had given his hands to the craft many times, in nicks, in burns, in stains of ink and glue. He did not regret a single mark. They were symbols of devotion. He sat back on his stool, listening to the faint crackle of the fire, the distant sounds of Vienna coming alive beyond the stone walls. Horses' hooves on cobble, a shopkeeper calling for deliveries, the sharp bark of a dog defending its corner of the world. But within these walls, silence. The kind of silence that speaks, that holds, that hums with memory. He placed a hand on the smooth wooden board and closed his eyes. "Tomorrow you will become a door," he murmured, "and someone will walk through you with their heart." The mid-morning light filtered through the frost-laced panes, catching dust motes mid-air like frozen sparks. The fire still glowed with a soft ember heat, casting just enough warmth to hold back the winter chill. The bookbinder returned to his bench, hands freshly washed, sleeves rolled back to the elbow. This was the part of the day he cherished most, the folding and sewing of signatures, where parchment, thread, and stillness converged into rhythm. Before him lay a neat stack of folded paper, each printed on a letterpress earlier that week. The text was rich and black, a new German translation of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. The words were strong and patient, like the hands that now prepared to house them. He began by folding the unbound folios into quires. Each quire, a collection of 4 or 5 sheets folded together to form 8 or 10 pages, was measured against a smooth guidestone kept from his grandfather's tools. Using his bone folder, he made each crease sharp and true, gliding the smooth, ivory-colored tool along the spine edge with practiced grace. The sound was soft, like a whisper against skin. One sheet, fold, smooth, stack. Another sheet, fold, smooth, stack. Over and over, like a lullaby sung with the hands. He remembered his father teaching him this when he was just a boy. Never fold in anger, he'd said. Books hold emotion. If you rush, the creases will carry your breathlessness. If you bind with frustration, the pages will warp, they remember. So he folded with patience and with love. The pile grew, 24 quires in total, each stacked atop the next like the ribs of a sleeping animal. He admired the symmetry for a moment, then turned to prepare the linen thread. From a small wooden drawer, he removed a spool of pale flax. The thread was thick but pliable, the kind preferred by monastic scribes. He measured out a length as long as his arm span, then another, then a third, snipping each with small iron scissors. These he coated in beeswax, rubbed down along the length until they glistened faintly, which would help them resist fraying and slide smoothly through the holes in the paper. He ran his thumb along the wax thread. It sang softly, like taut string on a violin. The needle he chose was curved, a style borrowed from sailmakers, ideal for arc-shaped passes. It too was passed through the wax, then fitted with the first thread. He warmed the needle's point over the fire, not enough to burn, but just enough to soften it for piercing. The stitching frame stood ready at the edge of the bench. He clamped the first signature gently in place, aligned its edges, and began. The act of sewing was not unlike prayer. In, out. Pull, in, out, pull, loop, tie, breathe. Each pass of the needle was precise, slow, and reverent. The thread moved through the parchment with a slight tug and whisper. He tied kettle stitches at the end of each quire, binding one to the next with loops that held firm yet offered just enough give to allow the book to open like breath. His hands moved automatically now, guided by muscle memory older than conscious thought. In his mind, he wandered. He remembered binding his first real commission, a devotional text for a midwife who lived near the river. She had paid with 4 loaves of bread and a bundle of lavender. When she came to collect the book, she wept. Not because of the words inside, but because of the feel of it, the texture, the weight, the way it opened as if waiting for her touch. He had never forgotten that moment. It was then he understood. Bookbinding wasn't about preserving words. It was about giving weight to the invisible, about holding something too soft to grasp and wrapping it in skin and thread until it could be passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. Hours passed unnoticed. The fire crackled. Outside, Vienna bustled faintly. Carts rattled, shutters opened. Voices rose and fell like tide. But here, in this room of paper and linen, only the silent choreography of needle and page remained. His hands moved through the final signature. He tied off the last stitch with a tiny knot, tucked the thread inward, and pressed the spine gently with his thumbs to feel its give. Perfect. He held the sewn book block in both hands, examining it from every angle. The spine was neat and tight, yet flexible. The quires aligned without a single page out of step. He smiled softly and whispered, "Well done." Then carefully he laid it between 2 smooth boards of oak and placed a weight atop it. The weight was simple, just a heavy piece of iron wrapped in cloth, but it served its purpose to let the book rest, settle, and memorize its shape. He stood for a moment, stretching his back. His fingers tingled faintly from the work, not in pain but in memory, the kind of tingling that comes from deep focus, from devotion. He crossed the room to his shelf and removed a small volume, bound in soft green leather, its corners worn to suede. Inside were sketches, notes, patterns. He flipped to a page where he had once written in the margin, "To bind a book is to bind a soul. To fold a page is to fold time. To thread the spine is to listen to the unseen. He closed the book and rested his palm on the cover. Sometimes when he stitched, he felt as though he were stitching his own body together, repairing the frayed edges of memory, strengthening the spine of his own soul. In, out, pull, in, out. Pull, and somewhere inside, he healed too. The bookbinder sat before the fire, a cup of barley tea steaming gently in his hand. The spine of the newly sewn book lay cooling beneath its iron weight, and the morning stitching still lingered in his fingers like a remembered melody. Now came a different rhythm, not of needle and thread, but of ink and mystery. He reached for a small bundle of loose, aged papers, unbound leaves brought to him days earlier by a local priest. They were delicate, browned at the edges, each page etched with the hand of another century. A manuscript of unknown authorship, the priest had said, found in the back of a vestry drawer beneath hymnals no one had touched in decades. The writing was cramped, almost shy, and between the printed lines were notes written in a softer hand, faded but still legible. Marginalia. The bookbinder loved marginalia. It was there in the quiet corners of a page where the truest voices lived. He held the first page to the light. The main text was printed in dark Gothic script, a theological commentary. But along the right margin, in faint ink that smelled faintly of vinegar and thyme, someone had written, "If God watches all, does he watch while I sleep?" It wasn't signed, it wasn't dated, but it pierced through the printed dogma like a heartbeat. The bookbinder exhaled through his nose and smiled. He had read hundreds of marginal notes over the years, some wise, some petty, some etched in grief, some in ecstasy, but all of them were traces of real people, not saints, not authors, but ordinary souls reaching through ink. He turned the next page. Here, another note, this one more rushed, its letters sharp with feeling. "He never wrote me back. Perhaps I was foolish." He paused. Was this someone's confession? A scholar mourning a lost romance? A monk struggling with forbidden longing? He ran a finger lightly over the faded lines. The ink had seeped deeper into the fibers here, as though the writer had pressed hard with their quill. The tension was palpable, even centuries later. He whispered softly, "I see you." It was something he always said when reading marginalia, a way of acknowledging the invisible, of honoring the scribes behind the scribbles, because even the briefest scratch of pen had meaning. Every mark was a message, a moment, a fragment of soul. The bookbinder knew that marginalia was dangerous in some circles. In royal courts, books were scrubbed clean of notes, lest they contradict official doctrine. In some libraries, marginalia was seen as defacement, a mar on the sacred object. But he disagreed. To him, a book without marginalia was a bell without an echo, a room without breath. He often wondered what future binders might think if they read his own notes, the ones he sometimes scribbled in pencil along the inside of covers or pasted behind end papers. Notes to himself, observations, private hopes. He had once written a single line behind the leather flap of a children's storybook. "May this book be touched by small hands and never forgotten." No one would ever see it, and yet he'd written it anyway. He returned to the pages before him, reading slowly. One note read, "I dreamed I was a tree, and the pages were my leaves." Another, "Forgive me, I was not kind when I wrote this." And this one, tucked against the binding gutter, almost lost to time. "Let the silence hold what the words cannot." He felt a shiver rise from somewhere deep. It was not the cold, it was recognition. Somehow, across centuries, someone had reached through ink and parchment to whisper truth into his hands. That was the alchemy of books, That was why he continued day after day to bind them, not for wealth, not for prestige, but for these moments of communion, for the invisible threads that tied reader to writer, and both to something greater. He picked up his own journal and opened it to a fresh page. With his favorite pen, a simple wooden nib dipped in iron galling, he wrote, "Between the margins, the soul speaks most clearly." He paused, letting the ink dry. Then, as if guided by instinct, he folded the page, slipped it between the manuscript leaves, and tied the stack gently with twine. He would bind it in soft grey leather, he decided, and add a hidden flap at the back for future readers to add their own thoughts. Books, after all, should not just be read, they should be listened to and spoken into. He placed the bundle aside with reverence and stood to stoke the fire. The manuscript may never be published, its author may remain nameless, but in that little room, warmed by firelight and silence, someone had been heard. By midday the light had shifted, not yet warm, but no longer silver and sharp. It settled gently over the workbench, casting the wood in honeyed tones, mellowing the edges of parchment and board. Outside, the sounds of the city rose and fell like breath. Footsteps crunching frost, a street vendor's low call, the faint jangle of reins as a carriage turned down a side street. Inside it was quiet. The bookbinder set his tools aside and rubbed the joints of his fingers slowly. Hours of stitching, folding, sanding, the kind of work that tightened tendons like drawn string. He flexed each finger deliberately. Then he stood, stretched his back, and moved toward the hearth. A kettle of water, long since cooled, was replaced with fresh from the pitcher. He added dried chamomile blossoms and a few shavings of licorice root, letting them steep in the iron pot as the fire came back to life. The smell was soft and calming, floral, earthy, a little sweet, the scent of pause. He had learned the tea ritual from an apprentice years ago, a young woman from the Hungarian borderlands who had studied herb lore with her grandmother. She'd taught him how different plants change flavor depending on the water's temperature, how steeping was not just chemistry, but patience. "Listen for the breath of the steam," she'd said once. "That's when it's ready." He watched now for that same breath, the first gentle exhale of vapor that rose like a spirit from the spout. When it came, he removed the kettle, poured into his favorite cup, a lopsided ceramic thing with a hairline crack down one side, and carried it to the bench. There he sat in silence and sipped. Around him, the room exhaled with him. Dust motes drifted, the fire hissed softly, the bindings rested under weight, the tools lay quiet, and in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. He reached for a soft cloth and gently wiped the surface of the bench. Paper dust had gathered, the fine residue of labor, clinging to the grain like ash. He moved slowly, not to disturb it too quickly. Dust, after all, told stories. Here a fine white powder from the trimmed edges of vellum. There, a brown fleck from the sanded spine of the beech board. And near the center, a faint smudge of charcoal where he'd marked a title line by hand. Each particle had been part of something greater, just as every moment in the shop was part of a book's becoming. He thought often of that, how nothing was wasted, how even the things that fell away during the process had once been essential. Pages trimmed, threads snipped, notes scribbled and tossed aside. Every part had played its role, just like in life. His tea cooled as he leaned back in his chair. From the corner of the room came the sound of rustling, the small grey mouse who sometimes visited from the alley, sniffing near the kindling box. He didn't mind. He even left a few breadcrumbs now and then. A silent companion. The bookbinder let his eyes wander the walls. Dozens of books lined the high shelves, not just those for clients, but personal ones too. A history of Gothic architecture, a copy of Don Quixote with a cracked spine, a small Latin grammar from his school days, its corners chewed by time. He remembered when he'd first learned to read, how letters once seemed like mysteries, symbols hiding secrets. Now he built houses for them. There was a knock at the back door, 3 soft raps. He stood, stretched once more, and opened the door to find the printer's apprentice, her red scarf pulled up over her mouth, cheeks flushed from the cold. In her hands, she held a bundle of freshly printed folios, still warm from the press. "For the tailor's book," she said, handing it over. "He wants it before Christmas." The bookbinder nodded, accepted the stack with a smile. "Tell him it will be ready." The apprentice lingered a moment, eyes darting to the shelves. "Your workshop always smells like stories," she said quietly. He chuckled. "That's just the tea, and a little dust." She grinned, gave a short bow, and turned back into the snowy street. Back inside, he set the bundle on the bench and untied the twine. The pages were beautiful, bold type, rich ink, careful layout. He ran a hand along the margins, clean, scented, ready. He took another sip of tea, now lukewarm, and let the weight of the work settle into his chest, not as burden, but as rhythm. This was his way, the fire, the folding, the stitching, the silence. And now, this moment of gentle in-between, tea and dust, breath and pause, before he began again. Some days he did not speak a word aloud. Some days he didn't need to, because the books listened. And in their company, he was never alone. By early afternoon, the fire had burned down to a deep, glowing bed of coals. The bookbinder leaned over the hearth with iron tongs, nudging the embers and feeding them 2 fresh logs split that morning. They hissed and crackled as they caught, sending up sparks like fireflies. The warmth returned slowly, rising into the room like a breath drawn in reverse. Today's bindings would be pressed, a slow and sacred stage in the process, one that required both patience and presence. For this, he would use the oldest piece of equipment in the shop, a heavy wooden screw press, passed down through 3 generations of his family. It stood in the corner, dark with age, iron-banded, and smooth from decades of hands turning its wheel. He approached it like one might approach a shrine. The press had seen thousands of books pass through it. He remembered its creaks and groans from childhood, when his father would let him turn the wheel with both hands while standing on a crate. The slow descent of the platen felt like something immense, as if the very air were being shaped beneath its weight. He ran his hands along its surface now. The wood cool despite the firelight, the iron joints flecked with soot. Then he knelt to retrieve a stack of soft cloths and thin, flat boards. These would cradle the book block and protect its shape during pressing. He returned to the bench, where the newly sewn quires had been resting under weight. Their spine had settled beautifully, slightly rounded, tightly held, and now it was ready for transformation. He lifted it gently and wrapped it in clean linen, then sandwiched it between 2 press boards, each lined with a waxed paper barrier to prevent moisture transfer. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he positioned the entire sandwich between the press jaws and began to turn the wheel. The creak of the press filled the room like a cello note. Deep, low, alive. The platen descended inch by inch, pressure increased, the air compressed. The book block, caught between those 2 ancient boards, surrendered itself, not crushed, but refined. He paused to feel the press's resistance, ensuring the pressure was balanced, not warping the spine. Once satisfied, he gave the wheel one final turn, just enough to seal the moment. Then he stepped back and waited. It would sit this way for several hours, sometimes overnight, depending on the season, the humidity, the paper. He could tell with uncanny accuracy when a book had been pressed too long or not enough. simply by holding it in his hand. But more than skill, it was intuition. The wood, the thread, the paper. They told him what they needed. He simply listened. While the press did its quiet work, the bookbinder turned to preparing the leather cover. He'd selected a piece of calf skin the day before, chestnut brown, supple yet strong, and left it soaking overnight in lime water to soften. He pulled it now from the basin and laid it across the cutting table, smoothing it with his hands. There was something intimate in working with leather. Unlike paper, which could be sharp or brittle, leather responded like skin. It breathed, it gave, it remembered touch. He trimmed it slowly, guided by the size of the spine and boards, leaving a generous border for wrapping. The edges he beveled with a curved knife, ensuring they would lay flat once glued. Then came the tooling. From a wooden drawer he pulled his brass stamps, ornate letters, corner patterns, and simple decorative flourishes. These he arranged beside a small charcoal brazier, where he placed one of the stamps to warm. Tooling the leather wasn't just about aesthetics, it was the book's face, its first impression. The marks had to be precise, deep enough to catch light, but not so deep they cracked the grain. He removed the heated stamp with iron tongs and pressed it firmly into the damp leather. A brief hiss, a darkening of the mark. The symbol, a small vine curling into a circle, appeared beneath his hand. He smiled. He would add more later once the cover was glued to the boards. For now, this was enough. The book was being shaped from every side, within and without. Thread held its breath. Leather shaped its memory. And the press gave it its spine. He sat nearby, sipping the last of the midday tea, and watched the light shift again. Outside, a snowflake drifted past the window. The afternoon had begun its slow slide toward evening. He thought of the books pressed in this same device by his grandfather. A hymnal for a rural church, a treatise on stars and navigation, a love letter disguised as a botanical guide. The press had held them all, and through them it held time. He often wondered what his own body would become if placed beneath such sacred weight. Would the scattered fragments of his thoughts align, bind, take form? Perhaps that was the deeper metaphor, that every life, like every book, required pressure to find its shape. When the press was ready, he would release it. But not yet. For now it held more than paper. It held stillness. It held waiting. It held the quiet miracle of becoming. As the shadows lengthened across the wooden floor and dusk wrapped its violet fingers around the city, the bookbinder prepared for the most delicate part of the work, the finishing. Gilding, stamping, polishing. Not merely decoration, but the final gesture. The kiss of closure. The part of the process where memory became matter. The fire had softened to an amber pulse. A single candle now lit the bench. Its flame danced gently in the still air, casting small gold reflections on the brass tools laid out beside the leather-bound volume. The press had been released. The book now sat upright, proud, its spine shaped and strong, boards aligned, pages trimmed. In his hands, the bookbinder held its future face. He removed a square of thin parchment and carefully unfolded it to reveal sheets of gold leaf, fragile as breath, luminous as flame. He had used this same bundle for years, each leaf cut from a larger square, each fold worn and flecked with the whisper of previous projects. Gold, to him, was not luxury. It was reverence, a light that lived without flame, a memory that shimmered without weight. He touched the edge of the leather cover with a damp cloth, marking the title's placement. Then, using a soft brush, He laid a thin layer of size, an adhesive made from garlic and fish glue, along the dampened spine where the gilding would go. The smell was subtle, pungent, earthy. While the size grew tacky, he reached for the warmed brass letters, small blocks arranged in a wooden tray. Each had been used hundreds of times, their handles worn smooth by fingers long gone. He found the needed letters for the title, a single Latin word, Veritas, and laid them gently beside the press. He paused. This was the moment he always felt them, the ones who came before. He could almost hear his grandfather's breath beside him, that quiet hum he used to make while pressing the stamps. Could see the way his father would squint at the angle of the gold, always working by firelight, always whispering something under his breath. A prayer, perhaps. Steady, the bookbinder whispered to himself now. And true. He lifted a sheet of gold leaf with a static brush and floated it over the prepared spine. It trembled, caught between gravity and grace, then fell gently into place. A breath held. Then, with the heated brass stamp, he pressed the first letter into the gold. A soft crackle, a hiss, and then silence. He lifted the stamp. The letter gleamed. He repeated the process for each letter, spacing them carefully, re-warming the tools between each press. With each impression, the title emerged, clear, proud, catching firelight as if lit from within. Truth. The gold flaked slightly at the edges. He would clean that gently with a silk cloth later. But for now, he sat back and looked at the finished spine. His heart swelled, not with pride, but with something quieter, belonging. This book, like all the others, was not his. He had simply helped it become. He lit another candle and turned to the end papers. Here, he would add his sigil again. Not the spiral this time, but a small drawn emblem with a quill and flame, pressed into the corner with a cold stamp. Not to claim ownership, but to mark presence. To say I was here, I listened, I helped. As he worked, he found himself humming, a tune from his childhood, an old lullaby his mother used to sing when he couldn't sleep. The melody had no words, just a rise and fall like breath, like walking uphill in moonlight. He hadn't thought of it in years, and yet now it returned, summoned perhaps by the gold, by the ghosts, by the hush of evening. He let the song carry him as he polished the corners with beeswax and buffed the surface of the leather to a soft glow. The candlelight caught in the curve of the spine, in the filigree pressed into the corners, in the gold title, still warm. And then, quite suddenly, he was done. The book sat quietly on the bench, still, complete, whole. He reached out and rested a hand on it, palm open, fingers soft. He closed his eyes and felt them again. All the teachers, all the hands that had once held tools like his, all the breaths taken over paper, all the silent prayers whispered into parchment, the ones who had folded and stitched and pressed long before he had ever been born, the ones who had passed the tools on, who had made mistakes and kept going, who had turned paper into memory. He whispered softly, "Thank you." Then he stood. Tomorrow the book would be delivered. It would be opened, read, touched by hands not yet known. But tonight it was enough to let it rest, to let the ghost settle, to let the gold shine, to let the story begin. There was a stillness that followed the finishing of a book, not just in the room but in the body, a lull between movements, a soft release of effort. The bookbinder felt it now, like the hush that comes after a long-held breath. He moved slowly, reverently, as if not to disturb something sacred. The fire was low again, casting deep shadows along the walls. Candlelight danced upon the shelves, those tall wooden ledges reaching up the stone wall like ribs of a great sleeping beast. They held books of every size, every scent, every silence. Some stood tall and proud in embossed leather. Others leaned gently on one another, their cloth spines faded from sunlight. All were witnesses, all were waiting. It was time to place the newest among them. The bookbinder rose from his bench, the finished volume in hand. It was cool now, its spine firm, its covers dry. The gold title on its edge caught the candlelight like a whispered promise. He turned it once in his hands, running his thumb along the edge, then crossed the room toward the far shelf. This section, near the corner, just beneath the loft beam, was where he kept the books not yet claimed. Commissioned, completed, but not yet delivered. Some waited mere days, others months, a few longer. He made space between two volumes, one a weathered treatise on medicine, the other a pale green journal with no name on its spine, and slid the new book gently into place. It nestled there without resistance, as if it had always belonged. He stood for a moment, simply watching it. Then he whispered, as he always did, "May you find the hands that need you. May your pages hold what cannot be said aloud. May you live longer than I." He turned and returned to the workbench where a small ledger awaited. Bound in thin goatskin, its pages were filled with neat columns and fine script. His record of every book ever made in this shop. Date, title, materials, owner, if known, and sometimes, just sometimes, a note about the soul of the book. He opened to a fresh page and wrote, "Veritas, bound December 18th, beechwood, calfskin, gold leaf, for J.K., name withheld. Spine held beautifully, finished with silence, whispered prayers said." He paused, then added beneath, "Felt as though it had waited a long time to be finished." That was all. He closed the ledger and set it aside. The shelves loomed in the dim light, a quiet archive of time. He knew the weight of every title, the slight lean of each spine. He could tell you which book held a lock of hair sewn into its back cover, or which one bore a hidden letter folded between its end papers. Each had a story, not just within its pages, but within its making. He walked slowly along the shelf now, fingers trailing lightly along the spines. Here was the book bound in red for the midwife who lost a child. Here a poet's last collection, printed in trembling ink by her brother. Here a musician's theory journal filled with diagrams of harmonics and stars. And here, tucked in the back, half hidden, the very first book he had ever bound alone. Crooked, imperfect, but whole. He smiled. Not all the books would be claimed. Some had outlived their owners, others were forgotten or commissioned and never collected. He didn't mind. He never sold them. He simply kept them, watched over them. They were his family of sorts. Sometimes he dreamed they whispered to each other at night. That they shared stories, spine to spine. That the ink rearranged itself when no one was looking. That if he leaned close enough, he might hear the words not written. He believed, or liked to believe, that the shelf itself held memory. That the wood remembered every book it carried. That the dust between the volumes was sacred. That silence over time became knowledge. He pulled one volume free, an old prayer book bound in black lambskin. He hadn't opened it in years. As he did now, the scent of old ink rose to greet him, rich like rain on parchment. Inside the cover, in tiny writing, he had once scribbled, "There are libraries where none of the books are written yet, and still they wait." He returned the book gently to its place. Then he turned and looked once more at the new arrival, nestled among its kin. Still. Silent. Alive. It would wait now. wait to be read, to be carried, to be remembered, but for tonight it rested. And so did he. The last light of day arrived slowly, slipping down the high stone walls of Vienna like honey across a warm plate. The city breathed differently at dusk, not hurried, not idle, but stretched, as if exhaling the burdens of the day. Roof lines glowed. Smoke curled upward from a dozen unseen chimneys. The windows across the alley flickered to life, one by one, like fireflies stirring from slumber. The bookbinder stood at his window, hands resting on the wooden sill worn smooth by years of quiet watching. He did not rush to finish his work. There was no bell to beat, no deadline carved in stone, only rhythm, and the rhythm now said, pause. Outside, the world turned gold. A woman walked below, carrying a basket of loaves wrapped in linen. Her child followed behind, dragging a wooden cart and humming. Across the square, a violinist set up his stool and lifted his bow, the first notes of a folk song drifting upward like a prayer to the night. Further still, a black cat leapt from stair to railing with the grace of a shadow. The bookbinder watched it all, not as one apart, but as one embedded in the texture of it. His hands may have worked in solitude, but his heart beat with the city. He had lived in this neighborhood his entire life. He knew its smells. Boiled cabbage in the colder months, roasted chestnuts on winter street corners, the faint bitterness of tobacco in the alleyways near the press. He knew its sounds, the creak of wagon wheels, the call of merchants, the sudden bells from the cathedral tower. He even knew its silences and which ones mattered most. Dusk brought memory with it. There was something in the color of the light that summoned the past like a tide, not in waves but in gentle trickles. He remembered a winter years ago when he'd bound a book of lullabies for a father who had just lost his wife. The man had sat quietly in the shop for an hour, not speaking, just listening to the rustle of paper and the crackle of the fire. When the book was finished, he held it to his chest like a newborn. He remembered a rainy spring when the ceiling had leaked and ruined an entire stack of finished volumes. He had wept then, not for the time lost, but for the words drowned before they could be read. And he remembered love, brief, like a poem, with a woman who wrote letters on handmade paper and left ink on his bedsheets. She had smelled like lavender and cedar, and left behind only a bookmark and the scent of longing. All of it lived here, in the workshop, in the dust. In the corners of the room that caught the golden dusk light just so. The violin outside played on and the bookbinder lit a lantern. Its soft orange glow joined the chorus of lights rising in windows across the street. He did not often venture out at this hour. The city at dusk was for lovers, drinkers, philosophers, and those whose work began when others rested. His realm was the quiet before, the hush of morning, the sacred solitude of thread and parchment. And yet he never felt lonely. The city sang to him, not in words but in layers, steam rising from sewer grates, laughter spilling from behind cafe curtains, the slap of boots on cobblestone, the rattle of shutters being drawn. He had once described it in a letter. Vienna at dusk is a book without a title. Everyone adds their own. He believed that still. He stepped outside for just a moment, wrapping a shawl over his shoulders, and stood beneath the archway of his door. The cold air met his skin like a soft slap, but it was welcome, refreshing, clarifying. He looked up at the sky, a deepening indigo streaked with rose. The stars had not yet arrived, but the moon waited patiently behind the cathedral roof. He could smell roasted chestnuts from a vendor 2 streets down. He heard a child laughing. He closed his eyes and let it all move through him. The books inside still held the day. The shelves remembered. The press was cooling, but out here, time softened. The weight lifted. The world became wider. He lingered until the first star blinked awake. Then he turned and stepped back into the workshop, closing the door gently behind him. The latch clicked softly into place, not to seal himself in, but to hold the stillness just a little longer. He returned to the bench, cleared the tools, folded the linen, smoothed the parchment scraps into a tidy bundle. The work was done for now. Soon he would climb the narrow stair to the loft above, where his bed waited. Simple, small, always warm on one side from the fire below. But not yet. There was one final thing to do. He sat, took up his journal and wrote, "The city exhaled at dusk, and I with it. The books have been kind today." The gold listened, the spine held. Outside the world hums. I will carry it with me into sleep. The night was fully settled now. The fire had dimmed to a slow heartbeat of red beneath the ash. The lantern's wick flickered low, casting long, liquid shadows that stretched across the floor like memory reaching out. The bookbinder moved quietly through the room, as if not to wake something holy. He folded the last piece of cloth and placed it gently on the shelf. He returned the leather strop to its drawer, dusted the gold leaf tray with a breath, and corked the ink bottle with care. These small motions, simple, ordinary, felt sacred now, like extinguishing candles after prayer. There was no rush, only closure. He washed his hands at the basin, the water chilled and sharp. Ink lingered at the edges of his nails. Beeswax clung beneath the cuticles. He rubbed slowly with lye soap, not to scrub the marks away, but to remember the day-through sensation, the small cuts, the residue of thread, the ghost of gold. He dried his hands on a linen cloth he'd used for years, frayed at the corners, stained with the colors of dozens of bindings, and smiled softly. He was tired, but not from labor. It was the still, soul-deep tiredness that came after a day of being fully alive. He crossed the room and opened the narrow cupboard door that led to the sleeping loft. The steps creaked beneath his weight, familiar and forgiving. At the top, a low-beamed room, tucked just beneath the eaves, wrapped in wool and cedar. A single cot, a small table, a patchwork quilt sewn by his mother when he was young enough to be carried. He placed his journal on the table, removed his boots, sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the city had gone to whispers. No more carts, no more bells, only the occasional clink of glass, or a murmur rising from a distant window. But inside, everything hummed. He looked down at his hands. These hands had folded thousands of pages, had pressed wood and parchment together with quiet strength, had stitched and cut and gilded and smoothed. But more than that, these hands had held moments, a widow's letter, a soldier's prayer, a child's first poem, a philosopher's final thoughts. And none of it had been his, and all of it had passed through him. He often wondered, if he could see the trail of his work, would it form a map? Would it glow like golden thread across the continent, tracing each book into each hand, into each moment of wonder or comfort or clarity? He would never know, and he didn't need to. The work had not been about knowing, it had been about holding. He lay back beneath the quilt, folding his hands across his chest as he often did, not in solemnity, but in rest. The candle at the bedside burned low, its wick trembling like a final sentence searching for punctuation. And then, as he often did before sleep, he whispered the same words he'd said every night for 30 years. May what is bound hold truth. May what is held hold peace. And may I remember the invisible hands that guide the rest. He closed his eyes. In the dark, he saw parchment and firelight. He heard thread sliding through paper, He felt the grain of beechwood beneath his fingers. He smelled leather, old ink, gold, and rain. But more than that, he felt something else. A presence, not a person, not a god, but the sense that something greater moved through the work, that by binding paper he had helped others bind their lives, stitch memory to emotion, past to future, word to breath, that by folding pages he had helped someone unfold, that by pressing books he had pressed pause on the rush of time, even if only for a moment. And perhaps, just perhaps, and that was all any of us could ask, to create something with care, to hold what others discard, to give weight to what is unseen, to bind the invisible. The candle guttered once, then twice, then went out, and the city, the books, the shelves, and the man who gave them shape, rested in silence, in stillness, in peace. The morning fog had settled thick across Vienna, curling through the alleys like breath exhaled by the city itself. From his window, the bookbinder watched as the rooftops vanished into the mist, their chimney stacks rising like the horns of old ships lost at sea. The world was softened, muted. Horses passed unseen but could be heard by the muffled clack of hooves and the faint jingle of trace chains. It was on such mornings that paper felt most alive. He wrapped himself in his wool coat, the one with the loose wooden buttons and the faint scent of beeswax, and stepped into the cold. The street greeted him like an old friend with secrets to share. The fog embraced him not with chill, but with hush. Today he would walk to the paper merchants' quarter, tucked beside the canals on the far side of the city. It was not far, but far enough to require rhythm, a pace both steady and slow, like breath, like stitching. He walked without haste, weaving past shuttered stalls and frozen fountains. The baker's window was steamed with warmth, displaying loaves he could not afford today, but admired nonetheless. A boy passed carrying a crate of apples, his laughter trailing like music behind him. At a narrow corner where the cobblestones were always slick, the bookbinder paused. He placed a gloved hand on the iron railing and steadied himself. The bridge ahead was dusted with frost, and the canal below moved sluggishly, barely more than a silver vein in the city's body. He often thought of Vienna as a living thing, not just a place, but a presence. You could feel its moods in the bricks, in the bells, in the mist. Today it was dreaming. The paper merchant's shop was tucked between a locksmith and an apothecary, a humble green door with a painted sign above it. Bookblatt and Sons, fine papers, since 1703. The bell above the door chimed a note so soft it might have been a sigh. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pulp and time. Stacks of paper lined the walls, in folios, sheets, rolls, deckled edges brushed with gold, rag paper in gentle creams and ivories, marbled sheets that looked like frozen smoke. The merchant himself, Herr Emil Buchblatt, appeared from behind a curtain. A man of delicate build, spectacles perched at the end of his nose, fingertips perpetually ink-stained. "Ah," he said, smiling beneath his silver moustache. "The binder of silence returns." They spoke little. They rarely did. Their exchange was more ritual than conversation, a shared reverence for texture, tooth, weight, and grain. The bookbinder removed his gloves, and together they walked the shelves. Emil pulled out drawers and unrolled samples, offering them like relics. There was a stack of laid paper from Holland, fine ribbed lines visible in the light, soft as pressed petals. A heavier parchment made from old linen, thick, creamy with the faint scent of clove oil. And a strange experimental batch made from mulberry fibers, translucent at the edges, whispering when moved. The bookbinder ran his fingers across them all. He did not rush. Paper spoke if you listened. He selected 10 sheets of the Holland laid, 6 of the mulberry, and 3 dozen standard rag for daily use. Emil wrapped them gently in silk paper, tied with red twine. As he paid, The merchant added a single sheet of deep blue paper to the bundle, thick, with gold specks pressed into its grain like constellations. "A gift," Emil said, "for whatever calls you in the quiet." The bookbinder nodded. He did not refuse gifts given in silence. They always meant something. He stepped back into the street, bundle tucked beneath his arm. The fog had lifted slightly, and the canal was now visible in glints and shimmers. He did not walk home immediately. Instead, he wandered, past the statue of the sleeping lion, past the old elm with names carved into its bark, past the printing house where the presses sang their heavy rhythm behind shuttered doors. Each step grounded him more. Halfway home he stopped at a stone bench beside a frozen fountain. He sat and untied the bundle just enough to pull out the blue paper. It caught the light like glass. He held it in both hands. It felt strange. Not strange in weight or surface, but in presence. Like it had a heartbeat. Like it had already seen the words it would one day carry. He imagined a letter written on it, to someone far away or not far at all, words that wouldn't come in any other form. A page destined not to be printed, but offered, hand to hand, soul to soul. He returned home slowly. By the time he reached the bindery, the fog had lifted, and sunlight spilled through the upper windows, turning the dust to gold. He placed the bundle on his workbench, unwrapped it with care, laid each sheet flat. Then he opened his journal and wrote, "There are pages that choose you. Some are born to be read, others are meant to be held." The snow began to fall that night, soft, thick flakes drifting down like the ash of forgotten dreams. By morning, the city lay under a pale blanket, its rooftops smoothed, its alleys hushed. The bookbinder stood at his doorway with a cup of warm barley tea in his hand and listened. To snow, you didn't listen for noise. You listened for absence. No carriages rattled, no footfalls echoed, only the occasional creak of roof timbers or the distant caw of a crow startled by the hush. Today he would walk to the forest's edge, to the cottage of the ink maker. She lived a short distance beyond the city walls, nestled in a clearing where the trees held their breath in winter. The journey would take an hour on foot, perhaps longer in the snow, but he did not mind. The path was familiar, worn not just by boots, but by the soles of memory. He packed light, a satchel lined with sheepskin to protect whatever pigment he might return with, a small parcel of dried pears as a gift, and a leather-bound notebook, now nearly full. He wrapped himself in wool, pulled a scarf tight, and stepped into the white. The world beyond the city was simpler. The roads narrowed, trees replaced chimneys. The river, half frozen, moved silently beside him as he walked. Each breath formed a cloud. Each step made a soft crunch beneath his boots. He passed the stone marker carved with the symbol of the woods, a twisted spiral with a dot in its center. Beyond it, the pines thickened and the snow grew deeper. It was there in a hollow between two leaning birches that the cottage appeared. Small, slanted, half covered in ivy that refused to die even in winter. Its windows were fogged, and smoke rose in a delicate column from the crooked chimney. He knocked twice. The door opened before the third knock. The ink-maker stood framed in firelight, her hair pinned back in a twist of silver and ash, her apron streaked with stains of ochre, indigo, and rust. She smiled without speaking and ushered him in. The warmth was immediate. It clung to him like wool. Inside, the room glowed with the quiet chaos of creation. Shelves lined with jars, roots soaking in oil, crushed minerals spread across trays like fallen stars, and above it all the scent, sharp, heady, layered, vinegar, resin, something sweet and sour and ancient, She handed him a mug of something warm and spicy, then finally said, "I thought you'd come." The ink maker was not like other artisans. She did not see color as decoration, but as presence. Each hue, she once told him, is a spirit, a witness. You don't use them, you court them. They moved together to the back table where today's pigments rested. A jar of walnut ink, dark as river mud, a dish of cochineal, pink as heartwood, a lump of indigo wrapped in silk, and, rarest of all, a vial of black drawn from oak gall and rusted iron. He examined each with reverence. She explained the provenance of each batch. The walnut ink had steeped for 10 days in snowmelt. The indigo had been beaten into paste by hand and sun-dried. The gall black had been buried underground for a season and forgotten, until it remembered itself and deepened into shadow. He chose 2 vials, the gall black and the cochineal pink. Then, as always, she paused, walked to the far cabinet, opened it slowly. Inside was her private shelf, pigments made not for sale but for offering, for those who had earned them. She pulled out a tiny clay pot sealed with wax and placed it in his hands. "For writing what cannot be rewritten," she said softly. He unsealed it. Inside, ink the color of bruised twilight, not black, not blue, something between. He met her eyes. She nodded. They sat near the fire afterward, sipping spiced drink and speaking in the way that old friends do, more in silence than in words. She asked about the bindery, about the snow, about the dreams that sometimes came when one fell asleep beside parchment. He asked about her garden, now frozen, about the bats that used to nest in the rafters, about the pigment she'd once made from violets and regret. When he stood to leave, she handed him a folded scrap of paper. "Write something with it," she said, nodding toward the ink. "Not for anyone else, just for the silence." He walked back as night fell. The snow deepened. The moon rose. In his satchel, the ink swirled silently, a soul not yet spoken. And somewhere within him a line began to form. He would write it, soon, but not yet. For now he simply walked. The snow returned that night, heavier this time. It fell thick and quiet across Vienna, turning streets into corridors of silence. Roofs vanished beneath its weight. Shop signs faded. Time itself seemed to pause. The world outside became a painting in monochrome, shadow and hush, light and fall. The bookbinder awoke before dawn to find the city gone. In its place, a world of whiteness. No footsteps marked the road. No voices stirred. Only the occasional groan of timber from nearby roofs, holding the weight of so much hush. Inside the bindery, the air was still. He did not light a fire, not yet. Instead, he sat at his bench and listened. The snowfall made the room feel further away from the world, as though it had slid sideways into a dream. His breath rose in soft clouds. His fingertips tingled. But he did not move to break the stillness. This, too, was part of the work. Today he would fold signatures. The paper from the merchant, cool to the touch, now rested and flat, waited in neat stacks beside a bone folder worn smooth from years of use. He brushed a thin layer of snow from the outer windowsill, then drew a candle close for warmth. He picked up the first sheet. Folding was unlike any other part of bookbinding. There was no thread, no glue, no pressing, no gilding, just hands, intention, and the breath between motions. It required no force, only cooperation. Paper wanted to be folded. It only asked to be seen first. He aligned the corners, ran his thumb along the spine, folded, pressed, held. Then again, sheet after sheet, fold after fold, each crease a vow, each signature a breath. Outside, the snow whispered. It was not a storm, not a threat, but a blessing. A reminder to slow, to soften. The world would wait. The books would wait. The hours would stretch like thread. He paused to warm his hands near the candle, then returned to the paper. Each signature was a gathering of pages, 4 sheets, sometimes 5, nested within each other like secrets. When folded, they held space for stories. Blank now, but soon to be printed, inked, sewn, and pressed into memory. He thought of them as ribs, the bones of a future book. He lost track of time. The candle burned halfway down. Snow gathered along the window edges, narrowing the light. Outside, Vienna remained muted, a city in hibernation. Inside, his breath, the rustle of paper, and the scrape of the folder created their own music. A waltz for one. He paused only once to write a single line in his notebook. Today I fold time, and time folds me. Then he returned to the rhythm. In the afternoon, a small crack echoed through the alley. The snap of ice breaking from a gutter, the cry of a bird disturbed. He looked up, blinked. Nearly 3 dozen signatures lay before him, folded and stacked. He ran a hand over the top one. It was warm, despite the cold. The act of folding, repeated again and again, had created a kind of inner heat, not just in the fingers, but in the heart. He tied the stack gently with cotton twine, labeled the bundle, laid paper, snow day, folded by silence. He lit a second candle, brewed a small pot of tea, just hot water and a shaving of dried apple peel. He sipped slowly, watching the snow deepen, and he thought of all the books in the world being folded right now, in distant monasteries, city print shops, schoolrooms. All the hands, all the folds. How paper creased beneath 1,000 thumbs. How the breath of the world moved between pages. He smiled. Snowfall slowed the city, but it never stopped the page. It was while searching for a misplaced spool of thread that the bookbinder found it, tucked between 2 boards in the old cabinet beneath the stairs, beneath a stack of muslin cloth and a bundle of unused spine strips. At first it seemed like nothing, just a folded piece of paper wrapped in twine, yellowed and thin. But when he picked it up, something inside him stilled. The twine was familiar, so was the paper, a creamy rag blend, flecked with petals, handmade. He had used it only once. He sat at his bench, untied the twine, and opened the fold. It was a letter, in his own hand. Unsent. The writing was delicate, a little faded, the ink browned from time. He read it slowly, as though reading the words of someone else, some other version of himself from another life. You will never read this, though I have written it 100 times in my head. You will not answer, though I feel your voice in the quiet corners of the shop. I do not know what this letter is for. Perhaps only to remind myself that once I felt something too large to hold. He stopped reading. The snow tapped faintly at the window. He exhaled, folded the letter closed, and held it. He tried to remember the moment he wrote it. He could picture the time, vaguely, a year, maybe 2 after she'd left. The woman who had filled his loft with the scent of ink and lavender, the one who'd written poems on scraps of parchment and hid them between his books, the one who sang while binding, who argued with him about punctuation and left in the night without saying goodbye. He hadn't remembered this letter, but his hands did. They trembled slightly. He stood and poured himself tea, the kind made from apple peel and clove, warm, simple, grounding. He returned to the bench and opened the letter again. This time he read every word. You told me once that books are like bodies, that they carry breath long after we stop reading. And now I find myself binding words I cannot speak, folding days that no longer open, sewing silence into spines. He smiled at that line. It was a younger grief, a poet's grief, but it still rang true. He laid the letter flat beside a blank sheet of parchment. Then, without plan or hesitation, he began to write. Not a reply, not a correction, but a companion, a letter to the man who had written the first. You did well. You carried the silence. You folded what could not be spoken. You stitched what unraveled. And though no one ever read the letter, the act of writing it was a kind of healing. He paused, then added, "Not all letters are meant to be sent. Some are meant to be survived." He folded both pages together, wrapped them in new cloth, and placed them inside a hollowed book, one he'd made years ago, shaped like a volume of poetry, but empty within. A secret archive. Inside it already lay 3 unsent letters. One to a friend lost to illness, one to his mother, long past, one to himself on the night of his 30th birthday. This one would rest among them, not to be forgotten, but to be held. The rest of the day passed quietly. He returned to his stitching, finished the spine of a book for a student of architecture. The rhythm soothed him, the thread moved cleanly, the kettle hummed. But something in the room had shifted, not darker, just deeper. Like the floorboards had listened, like the walls now held a breath they hadn't before. That night, before bed, he wrote one more line in his journal. Some bindings are invisible, some stories never leave the shelf, and some letters are worth writing even if no one reads them. It was just after first snowmelt when the letter arrived, delivered by hand, a novice monk, cheeks red from the cold, boots damp from the slush in the monastery road. He said nothing, only bowed deeply and handed the envelope over, sealed with wax in the shape of a single open eye. The bookbinder recognized the mark. It belonged to the monastery at Krems, a quiet order of Benedictine monks known for their chant and their honeyed parchment. He hadn't received a commission from them in years. The seal cracked under his fingers. Inside, a request. A book of prayers, hand-stitched, leather-bound, but not printed, not written, not seen. This one was to be read by touch. He stood in silence for a long while after reading. It would be his first commission for a blind reader, and he understood immediately that everything would need to change. No ink, no ornament, no flourished title or gilded edge. Instead, softness, shape, texture, form. A book not for the eyes, but for the soul through the fingertips. He began with the paper. Ordinary parchment would not suffice. It had to be thick yet yielding, embossable but gentle. He selected a rag cotton blend, pressed, not glazed, with just enough tooth to hold indentations. Next he trimmed each sheet by hand, larger than usual, square-edged instead of rounded. He left extra margin on all sides, imagining how the reader's fingers might drift from the edge, needing space to return. He would not use ink at all. Instead, he retrieved his rarely used embossing tools, rounded styluses, once given to him by a retired cartographer. He warmed them beside the fire, letting the tips grow pliable. Then slowly, he practiced. A raised dot, a line, a curve. He closed his eyes and followed them with his hand. Again, again, until the dots spoke. He spent the evening studying Braille. Not just its shape, but its feeling, the distance between dots, the rhythm of language expressed through contact. A quiet language, a patient language. It reminded him of stitching, each letter a stitch, each word a seam, each page a garment worn by the fingertips. The next morning, he began embossing in earnest, not with a machine, not with heat, but with his own hand, slowly, deliberately. He traced each letter of the opening prayer, "Lord, be near," until the page rose gently beneath his fingers as though whispering, "I am here." He imagined the monk reading it, not scanning but listening, not looking but knowing. It changed everything. The cover would be suede, software yielding. Quiet. No hardboard, no sharp edge. He softened each corner, padded the spine, made it supple like cloth. The closure was not a clasp, but a tie, braided ribbon that could be felt and trusted. No gold, no shine, only presence. When the book was finished, he did not write his usual signature. Instead, he placed a single raised spiral on the last page, his mark, not to be seen, but to be found. He wrapped the book in wool, tied it with cotton, and walked it himself to the monastery, despite the frost, despite the distance. He arrived at dusk. The bells had just begun to ring. The monk who met him at the door was older, wrapped in grey, his eyes cloudy but serene. The bookbinder said only, "It is ready." The monk reached out, not to take the book, but to touch the bookbinder's face, gently, a silent thank you. Then his hands found the wool bundle. He held it as if it glowed. Before the door closed behind him, the monk whispered, "We do not read with our eyes alone. The soul reads what the heart remembers." The bookbinder returned home late, lit no fire, only a candle, and sat in the silence. He held the embossing stylus in his hand, now warm from use, and let the quiet wrap around him like suede. That night, he wrote only this in his journal: "Some books are not read, they are felt, and remembered by the skin." The book arrived wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine so tight it bit into the corners. The package was damp from travel, its edges slightly torn. It had been handled with haste, perhaps regret. There was no letter enclosed, only a small card with a name, barely legible, and 3 words written in fading ink: "Please make whole." The bookbinder did not recognize the name, but he recognized the look of the book before he even unwrapped it. Broken spine, detached cover. Pages curled from water damage. A book left too long in a damp attic, perhaps. Forgotten, then remembered. He untied the twine slowly, as if unwinding a story in reverse. The book's title had long since worn away. The leather was cracked, brittle at the hinges and peeling from the spine. When he opened it, a faint scent of mildew rose, not unpleasant, just sad. A scent of what had been lost. Inside, poetry. Handwritten, not printed. Ink faded to ghost lines. Poems of longing, mostly. Some of love. One short line repeated between verses. "I stayed, you didn't." He read a few stanzas aloud, then closed the book and laid his hand over the broken spine. "I hear you," he whispered. Restoration is a different art than creation. You begin with injury. You work around scars. You honor what remains. He lit the hearth and brought out his gentlest tools, the spine softener, the parchment glue, the silk lining. He peeled back the cracked leather with a damp cloth, working slowly so as not to tear further. Each motion was deliberate, reverent. The old spine liner crumbled in his fingers. He replaced it with new linen, folded 3 times for strength. Then he pressed the book between warm boards, not to flatten but to soothe. While it rested, he repaired the end papers. One was torn. A sharp, desperate rip through a handwritten dedication. For the days we were more than memory. He stitched the tear shut with rice paper and glue, not to hide it, but to soften it. Some pages were water-warped, some ink blurred, some margins stained. He did not try to erase them. He let the flaws remain. He believed in visible healing, that even mended, the book should show where it had been broken. The next morning, he reattached the covers. They had dried into a gentle curve, like palms folding around a prayer. The new spine moved slightly when pressed, flexible but firm. He rubbed the leather with balm, coaxing it back from brittleness. The color deepened. The grain awakened. Finally, he traced the front cover with his finger, as if reading the title that no longer showed. The book did not need to be renamed. It only needed to be held again. He wrapped it in linen and tied it with new twine, but he did not deliver it right away. Instead, he placed it on the shelf beside his workbench and let it rest for 2 nights, not for drying, but for acknowledgement. On the 3rd morning, he opened his journal and wrote, "Some books arrive already weeping. Others arrive long after they've stopped." This one came in silence and left a little louder. Then, beneath that, "We do not erase the break. We simply remind it how to hold again." He never heard back from the person who sent it. But he didn't need to. The book had spoken and been listened to.